I am a self-confessed taphophile, and no, it's not what you're thinking. Behave yourself. A taphophile is someone who has a love or interest in graveyards or cemeteries. It comes from the Greek word tapho or taphos, which simply means grave. And for a lot of people, the idea of being interested or having a love of graveyards is quite alien. It's a morbid, horrible thing. But actually, graveyards can tell us an awful lot about the community that we live in, the society that we are, and about our past. It's a rich history book of life and death. To a lot of people, a graveyard is somewhere simply to bury the dead. Gravestones often contain information such as name, date of entry, date of departure, and perhaps a scripture or a few words that says something about the person. But if you look carefully, there's so much more information that you can get from gravestones. Now, every village graveyard will always contain one of these, an impressive crypt from the local lord of the manor. This one belonged to the Reverend Alfred Theophilus Lee, whose father, Sir John Theophilus Lee, was a personal friend of the Duke of Wellington. And this particular crypt contains the remains of an awful lot of Alfred's brothers and sisters who all died very early on in their lives, and they're buried here. Now, here's a really interesting one if you do a bit of research. Engineer Commander Mayne, he was on board his ship HMS Shakespeare in May of 1918 off the coast of Essex, Harwich it was, when unfortunately it ran into a sea mine. It exploded. There was just one fatality. It was Commander Mayne. His body was brought all the way back to the village of his birth, and this is where he's buried. And when you look at gravestones and grave markers, you're looking for several things. On the side here you can see the writing, but take a look at this one. It's a double gravestone. It's a brother and sister. They died in the early 18th century, and they both died before they were married, hence the idea of cherubs. Cherubs signify innocence, so both of them died at an early age and they had the cherubs put on their graves. Now, this is another really interesting one, James and Martha West. Now, you notice that the hands at the top here, the left hand side is a female and the right is the male. James died first, so the symbolism here is James is now in heaven waiting to reach out and take Martha's hand and guide her to everlasting life. It's a very common symbolism in modern English churchyards. But if you want to see something impressive for a gravestone, just look at these three. They are absolutely magnificent. Now, this is the grave of the family of William Millet, and unfortunately for William and his entire family, they contracted the plague. Now, can you see, not just ornate, but look, it's the skull there. Memento morte, which means remember that you too will die. Sadly, they died of the plague in the early 18th century. It was a flu epidemic that was sweeping the country. Just along a bit is probably the best preserved writing for a 280-year-old gravestone I've ever seen, 1736, but it's protected by the gravestone in front. Now, as you come along the perimeter of the fence, you'll notice these grave markers here. They are not in situ. These grave markers have been purposely removed to make room for new burials, a very common practice in English churchyards. And as we come round the back of this particular church, you'll see this is the newer part, if you like, and gravestones from the 1920s right through to today. These are the burials, so these are relatively new compared to the old ones. But one they have left is this one here. Surprise, surprise, Admiral Williams, who died in 1934. He was an admiral during the time of wooden warships. But this is a really sad one because I know the story behind it. Treasured memories of my precious son, Brian Marsh. Brian was a mechanic working in the engineer's workshop, and unfortunately one day he was hit on the head with a spanner. It knocked him out, but there didn't seem to be any damage. Sadly, 2 months later, Brian developed a brain tumour and died. And by far the oldest grave marker in the churchyard, Mark White, deceased 1638. As you walk round, it's an amazing place, because every single one of these headstones represents a human life. that were not much difference from you and me. They lived and they laughed, they cried, they had good times and bad, and this is where they finally come to rest, in a place of particularly peace. It's beautiful. But every churchyard has a story to tell. You just have to go and look for it.